In 2007, 1 out of every 2 smartphones on Earth was a Nokia. Not 1 in 5, not 1 in 3, 1 in 2. Nokia was selling 435 million phones a year. Revenue had crossed $51 billion. Their market cap was over $100 billion. They weren't just winning, they were untouchable. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Nokia had already built the future. Years before the iPhone existed, Nokia's own engineers had developed touchscreen technology, smartphone prototypes, and internet-connected devices that were ahead of their time. They had the future in their hands, and they chose not to use it. Then Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco, and Nokia laughed. 6 years later, their CEO stood at a podium and said 7 words that became one of the most painful sentences in business history.
We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost.
This is not the story of a company that got beaten. This is the story of a company that beat itself. Because Nokia's collapse had nothing to do with technology. It had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with ego. The kind of ego that grows quietly inside a company when it gets too comfortable with its own greatness. The kind that whispers, "We've already won. Why change?" This is the real story of Nokia and the price that ego charged. To understand how Nokia fell, you have to first understand how high it climbed. Nokia didn't start as a phone company. It started in 1865 as a paper mill in Finland. Over a century, it moved through rubber boots, cables, and televisions before discovering mobile phones almost by accident. But once Nokia found mobile, it dominated. The Nokia 3310 became a cultural icon. Americans who had never thought about Finland knew exactly what that ringtone sounded like. The Nokia 1100 sold over 250 million units, the best-selling phone in human history. By 2007, Nokia controlled 40% of all mobile phones on Earth. In smartphones specifically, Nokia held over 50% of the global market. Apple, at that exact moment, held 5%. Nokia wasn't just ahead. They were in a different league entirely. And with that dominance came something invisible, something dangerous. The belief that they had already figured it out. Ego had been born. January 9th, 2007, San Francisco. Steve Jobs walked onto a stage and announced Apple was reinventing the phone. Nokia's leadership looked at the iPhone, and they weren't worried. They were amused. The iPhone had no physical keyboard, poor battery life, a price of $499. It couldn't even run third-party apps yet. Nokia's engineers had correctly identified real weaknesses. But here's the detail that should stop you cold. Nokia had already built touchscreen technology years before Apple. Their own research labs had developed prototypes with touch interfaces, internet connectivity, and app ecosystems. A Nokia engineer had once demonstrated a touchscreen device that looked remarkably close to what Apple would release in 2007. Nokia had seen the future and decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Why? Because their current phones were selling. Numbers were strong. Market share was enormous. Why fix something that isn't broken? That question, more than any single decision, is what destroyed Nokia. Because the iPhone wasn't competing with Nokia's hardware, it was redefining what a phone was. Nokia was asking, is this a better phone? The world was asking, does this change everything? And those two questions had completely different answers. Quick question before we continue. What was your first Nokia phone? Drop the model below. Now here's where things got much worse. In 2010, Nokia's board made a decision that would define everything that followed. They hired a new CEO named Stephen Elop, a former Microsoft executive who had never run a phone company in his life. He was about to inherit one of the biggest corporate crises in modern history. And what Elop found inside Nokia shocked him. Picture this scene. An engineer sits in a meeting room in Espoo, Finland. He's been working on Nokia's Symbian operating system for 3 years. He knows that it's falling apart. That updating it is like trying to renovate a building that's structurally compromised. Every fix creates new problems. He's prepared a presentation, slides, data, evidence. But before the meeting starts, his manager pulls him aside. Be careful how you frame this. Leadership doesn't want to hear that we have problems. The engineer softens the presentation. The warning never reaches the top. This wasn't one incident. This was Nokia's culture. Thousands of employees could see the company slipping, but many felt powerless to stop it. In a company obsessed with winning, admitting problems felt dangerous. Meanwhile, Android had launched. Samsung had jumped in. Google was giving the operating system away for free. A new generation of smartphones was flooding the market, not built around physical toughness, but around seamless software experience. Engineers wanted change. Executives wanted stability. And that conflict, happening in meeting rooms and hallways across Nokia's headquarters, was the real battle that determined Nokia's fate. Not Apple, not Samsung. Nokia versus Nokia. What Nokia's engineers were discovering during this period would have terrified the board if they'd fully understood it. Symbian wasn't just behind. It was structurally incapable of competing. Rebuilding it would take years Nokia didn't have. One decision made in 2011 would make recovery almost impossible. In February of that year, Stephen Elop stood up and announced Nokia was abandoning Symbian and betting everything on Microsoft's Windows Phone operating system. He called it a burning platform. Nokia was on fire, and the only choice was to jump. It was the right call. 2 years too late. By then, Android and iOS had already divided the world between them. There was no space left for a third platform. Users had chosen. Developers had chosen. Nokia had spent years building walls against admitting they were wrong, and those walls had become their prison. September 2013, Microsoft announced it was acquiring Nokia's phone business. The price? $7.2 billion. Let that number sit for a moment. In 2007, Nokia was worth over $100 billion. Just 6 years later, its entire phone business sold for $7.2 billion. $93 billion of value gone. At the press conference, Stephen Elop stood at the podium, the man who had been brought in to save Nokia, who had made the desperate last bet on Microsoft, who had watched the company he inherited slowly reach its end. He reportedly ended his speech with these words: "We didn't do anything wrong, but somehow we lost." And in a strange way, he was right. Nokia hadn't done anything obviously wrong. They had built great products, hired brilliant engineers, reached billions of customers. But they had done something subtler, something that doesn't show up in quarterly reports. They had let their past success convince them they didn't need to change. And that belief, that quiet, comfortable, dangerous belief, was the most expensive mistake in Nokia's history. Nokia's story didn't end completely. The brand still exists in telecommunications infrastructure that powers mobile networks worldwide. In that world, Nokia remains a serious player. But the phones, the devices that a billion people carried in their pockets, that defined a generation, those are gone. And the lesson Nokia left behind isn't really about technology. Nokia didn't lose because Apple was smarter. Nokia lost because yesterday's success convinced them they didn't need to change. And that's how giants disappear. What do you think? Drop it in the comments. And if this video gave you something to think about, subscribe.